Hi gang, it's me, E.H. Ivins, and today's topic is we're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. Now, let me get right to it. It seems like an eternity ago, but 3 months ago, almost 4 months ago, I did an audio podcast. You can look it up at the Radical Reset audio podcast site, which is available to you on all streaming platforms, Spotify, Google, Apple Play, whatever it is that you follow. And in that podcast, I said at the beginning of the COVID crisis, and I said it clearly and unequivocally, before we do anything, let's take a moment and think about it. I mean, before we go jumping off the deep end, before we go into the major freakout, before we throw mountains of money at it, before we go apeshit crazy, let's stop and let this thing go on for a little while. My points were, number one, it was clear even then that it wasn't killing children. Thank God. It was only killing old people like me, and then it was only killing old people like me. And when I say that, I know I'm speaking in a broad generalization, and I'm not denying the seriousness of the COVID crisis, nor am I really in a hurry to die myself. Now, I don't have any of the three big risk factors, which is heart disease, lung disease, or diabetes, but that aside, it's people my age, over 60, that are getting hit disproportionately, and I knew that even then. We knew that even then. But the point is, you can't make public policy based on what's happening to one group of people, and my thought was, let's just wait and see because of the law of unintended consequences. And every time the government legislates, whether it's from the left or the right, they almost never think about what the consequences are of what they've done. Oh, there are isolated voices, like, for example, Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, and some of the more conservative Republicans, like Tom, what's his name, from Oklahoma, I can't think of it off the top of my head, Tom Cotton, who got into this big stink with the New York Times and got this. Anyway, that's not what this is about. Anyway, but there were lonely voices of warning that this, and in particular about the enhanced unemployment benefits. The topic of today's show is going to be the horrible predicament we've put ourselves in. We're on the edge of the cliff as a result of the enhanced unemployment benefits. What do I mean? So as part of the $3 trillion rescue and the checks for $1,200 that we all got per person, and some people got because of their family members, many more, $500 per child, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, when you do the math, it's an enormous disincentive to work. In other words, if you were, before the COVID crisis, let's just say a $15 an hour worker. In other words, the minimum wage is, depending on where you are, anywhere from, less than $10 to $15, depending on the group. So let's pretend you're at the top of the enforced minimum wage laws. You're making $15 an hour, which means you're making, around a little over $30,000 a year. And the COVID crisis comes, and you're working primarily in the hospitality industry, restaurants, hotels, that kind of thing, where an enormous slug group of American workers work. And we're talking today, there are a little over 40 million people receiving these enhanced unemployment benefits, most of whom were making money at the lower end of the spectrum. And suddenly you're presented with an enhanced unemployment benefit. So the average unemployment benefit across the country in all states combined, the average unemployment benefit is $350 per week. Some states like California are higher. There it's $450 a week. Some states are lower. But as an average across the country, it's a statistical fact that the average unemployment benefit is $350 a week. Now, if you add to that the $600 of enhanced federal benefit, you get $950 a week, which is just shy of earning $50,000 a year on unemployment for doing absolutely nothing. That is an enormous difference between what you would be making if you were working for $15 or $16 or $17 an hour. In fact, I did the math. It comes out to the equivalent of making $23.50 per hour. Now, that's the kind of money that a skilled worker gets. So here you are, you're a comparatively unskilled worker, you're working in the hospitality industry, let's say, or the service industry, or something which doesn't require a college degree. You're just a working guy. There's nothing wrong. Totally honorable, totally fine. And you're given the choice of going back to work as the lockdowns are eased and from state to state, or staying at home and collecting this unemployment benefit. Now, while you've been staying at home and collecting this unemployment benefit, which is more than you were ever making, you're getting paid for doing absolutely nothing, you're learning how to game the system. So, for example, all state unemployment systems require that you look for a job. But what does that really mean, look for a job? You don't have to be a PhD or a clever criminal to figure this out. All you got to do is go on Indeed.com, for example, which is an aggregator of want ads online. Just to use one example, there are many, Monster.com, yada, yada, yada. You go on and you submit applications. Now, almost none of those applications are ever replied to. You can submit it to any kind of job. You could be a guy without a college degree submitting to work as an orthopedic surgeon in a clinic, and of course they're going to laugh it out when they get that resume out the other end, but it satisfies the requirement of the state to say that you've been putting in applications for jobs. So when you go to validate, your next week's unemployment check, all you got to do is say, I applied to this one, this one, this one, this one, and you did. Now you did it with absolutely no expectation. You did it no follow-up. You made no phone calls. You made no effort to get hired. You don't really want to get hired. And this is, by the way, how, I want to say liberals are fooled, leftists are fooled, but maybe they're not fooled. They just, figures lie and liars figure. There's a statistic that says people on unemployment are actually more likely to look for work than people not on unemployment, but the fact is they're gaming the system. They're counting the people gaming the system. They're not really looking for work. Come on, cut the bullshit. They're pretending to look for work. Just like years ago when I used to run a sales organization, I used to have a requirement that the salesman made so many phone calls per day. Well, it wasn't long before they figured out all they had to do was call places that they knew would be closed, like doctors' offices, during lunch hour, and call and talk to the answering machine, which would show up on their digital counts on their telephones as having made the phone call, when in fact they just didn't want to talk to anybody and were pretending. Well, that's what's going on with the unemployment. They're pretending. And there are millions of people across America now gaming the system, tens of millions, who are gaming the system. That's a fact. To pretend that they're looking for new work, but they're not, because the benefit doesn't run out to the end of July. And people who are making in that, particularly in the lower end, it's irrational to think they're going to run back to make, 2/3 less than what they're collecting in unemployment. And that's really what we're kind of talking about. We're talking about $350 a week versus $950 a week. Who's going to run back to work? And the answer is nobody who's in their right mind. Okay, well, actually, when you're making $15 an hour, you're making $600 a week. But would you trade $600 a week for $950 a week? Are you irrational? Of course. The incentive is we're subsidizing sloth. It's one of the 7 deadly sins. We're paying people to stay home and do nothing and pretend to look for work. Now, that in and of itself is bad enough, but that is not the unintended consequence I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is where is the cliff that we've put ourselves in now. Because as a result of these benefits, this is why we haven't had mass evictions out of rental units. This is why we're not experiencing mass foreclosures from real estate. This is why retail spending, you've been maybe seen some articles. I'm a regular reader of the Wall Street Journal, but you could read it in the New York Times, you could read it in your local newspaper. Retail sales were, for example, last month much stronger than what were expected, but they were much stronger because the government is subsidizing them through these enhanced unemployment benefits. And people at this lower end of the spectrum tend to not be the most responsible. Now, that's not a politically correct thing to say, but it's a fact anyway. The people are working, particularly later in life, at my age, making $15 an hour is a pretty good indication they didn't have much foresight to begin with, and are not big practitioners of short-term sacrifice, long-term gain, which is something that their parents should have taught them. So they're more than happy to sit there on this unemployment until July the 31st, and they figure, and they're figuring correctly, that the government's not going to let this lapse. And already Donald Trump, who is up for re-election, and the Democratic Congress, Nancy Pelosi, are basically trying to figure out how to extend these benefits probably through at least January 31st. But the longer they go on, now they're going to justify this by trying to create a soft landing. They'll use some kind of euphemism. We want to ease people out of this. We want to ease back into the workforce. But there are a couple things you got to remember here. Number one, we're still subsidizing sloth. There is a reason that sloth/laziness is one of the 7 deadly mortal sins. Because if you're lazy, you're going nowhere. Let's just call it what it is. And people, when you're paying them to be lazy, they're going to be lazy. It would be as if you were passing out, marijuana joints to the whole country and saying, go home, smoke up, relax. People are going to relax. If you're going to hand out the free shit, they're going to take the free shit. If you hang out the free shit here sign, they're going to show up with the free shit here sign, particularly at the lower end of the income spectrum. Again, I know that's not politically correct, but fuck political correctness. Let's just talk like grown-ups here. And we've created a artificial floor under apartment complexes and car payments and house payments, all being supported by these enhanced unemployment benefits. So of course they're going to extend them. The theory being to give people, the economy, a chance to recover and people a chance to return to work. That's a great theory, but it runs contrary to the incentive. The incentive is to pretend to look for work and stay home. If they extend to January, do exactly the same thing. If they extend to next July, do exactly the same thing. What we're seeing here is the beginnings of UBI, Universal Basic Income. This is going to be the slippery slope that lands us in a situation where the government is going to literally experiment, I believe, with UBI, the kind that Andrew Yang talked about. But Andrew Yang, who I've been complimentary about in the past, talked about UBI as a replacement for all other government social programs. In other words, his idea was we pay $1,000 a month to each and every American, okay, and I'm not quite sure what the family calculation is. You'll have to consult with Yang's website on that. He's doing a podcast now, and he talks about it all the time. It's not going to be hard to find. But he's talking about that in lieu of welfare, AFDC, in lieu of food stamps, in lieu of housing supports, in lieu of all that. You wipe all that away and you replace it with the UBI. That sort of kind of makes sense, particularly in a technological economy, as a lot of jobs are going to be automated out of existence in the future. This could create a transition that's different from other times in the past. In other words, when we transitioned as a country from being an agricultural economy back in the 19th century to an industrial economy in the early 20th through the mid to late 20th century, and now to a technological economy, and soon to an automated economy, every time we made these transitions, the economy took care of itself. Jobs were created, that's the way the free market works, to replace the ones that are lost. So while no one's making, buggy whips anymore, lots of people are making cars. But what happens when we transition to an economy where a car can be made by a robot with no human being touching it from start to finish, which we're not far away from? What happens when you go to McDonald's and we've priced minimum wage so high, we raise it to, let's say, $15 an hour. Let's say Joe Biden's elected president, which at this point is probable if you believe the polls, and he gets a Democratic Congress, which is extremely possible if you believe the polls, and they pass an increase in the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. They're going to price everyone at the lower end out of the entry-level jobs, okay? And so fast food and all these other places are going to automate. There's going to be no place for these low-wage workers to go. And that's the case for UBI, Universal Basic Income. You can't just leave them on the street, so goes the theory. Therefore, we have to replace it with this universal basic income, and I kind of buy it. I don't agree with it 100%. I have a lot of reservations about it. Anything you subsidize, including laziness, you get more of. There's a lot of discussion to be had. Andrew Yang has some good answers to some of these things, but that's not what's going on here in Congress. What's going on here is not Andrew Yang's idea. This is in addition to everything else. We're paying these enhanced unemployment benefits on top of AFDC, on top of food stamps, on top of Project Head Start for kids at school in the morning, giving them breakfast, on top of everything else. We're introducing this new plan, and we don't have the money for it. We're going to have a federal budget deficit of over $1 trillion, which, as I've spoken to before, we are funding by printing fiat currency. That's not an Italian card. That just means we're printing money out of thin air. The Federal Reserve is buying government bonds to push this money into circulation, which inevitably, because too much money chasing too few goods is the cause of inflation, is going to cause an inflation. Now let me stop here. I don't want to just introduce concepts without explaining what I mean. Why does too much money chasing too few goods cause inflation? Because goods are like a sponge and money is the water. So in other words, if the government prints up trillions and trillions of dollars to support all these programs, but they're not justified by the economy. In other words, the economy hasn't grown enough to absorb all this money. No, in fact, fewer goods and services are being produced because all these people are out of work. There are fewer choices of what to buy. There are fewer things to spend money on. Right now, think about it. Think about your own life. You can see, even when you go to the grocery store, some choices are limited. Certainly not expanding. Even if you're going to argue with me about that, they're certainly not expanding. No one's going to argue with me about that. Therefore, as we pump these trillions of dollars into circulation, and there's not enough goods or services to absorb them, and there's not enough people working, we have 40 million people collecting unemployment to pay for them, the money has to go somewhere. And what happens is prices rise like a sponge, soaking up excess water, and this is why too much money being printed to chase or to buy too few goods, there aren't enough things for the money to buy, the price of the existing goods will go up to soak up the extra money, and that's how you get inflation. Don't buy any other theory. The only thing that causes inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Not low unemployment like some people think. That's Keynesian and that's bullshit. It's been largely discredited, but it's repeated all the time. And I'm not going to get into what Keynesian is referring to. John Maynard Keynes was an economist back in the early 20th and late 19th century, actually early 20th century primarily, in England. And he's the mainstream economist of choice today, kind of the democratic socialist idea, although I believe if he were alive today, he'd be spinning in his grave at this shit, but I digress. So having said that, we're in a very dangerous situation. Now, the Congress is faced with, if they withdraw the unemployment, here's why we're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. If the Congress and the president do not extend the unemployment benefits, watch apartment vacancies and therefore foreclosures and therefore banks solvency and home foreclosures and car repossessions, and the list goes on, go through the roof, because all of these things are basically the government that's making people's car payments, making people's rent payments, making people's mortgage payments for them. By funneling this $50,000 unemployed income into people's hands, we are essentially taking care of all of their expenses. So we're seeing an artificially better economy than it really is. It's actually much, much worse. If it weren't for this, we would be in a much different situation. We would be in, although statistically we're in a depression right now, it doesn't feel like it. Statistically, we're in a worse situation now than we were at the Great Depression in some ways, particularly in the unemployment situation. And yet, it doesn't seem that way, I know, because we're all collecting, I'm not personally, but millions, tens of millions of Americans. I mean, I'm on Social Security and things like that, so I am certainly far from pristine. I'm just telling you that these enhanced unemployment benefits are what's holding up the economy right now in many, many ways. And when we withdraw them, okay, when it comes down to the governments, if they stop paying it, instant crash. Now, when you're dealing in a, what's the word I'm looking for? In a campaign year, in an election year, obviously, and every year is an election year, sort of, but I mean, this is a big one with the presidency and the whole Senate, and or most of the Senate and the entire House up for re-election. It's a big election year. There isn't a politician on the left or right who isn't, well, there are a few. Maybe not Ron Paul, maybe not, Tom Cotton. There are a few, maybe not Josh Hawley, but the vast majority of these Congress people, left and right, are going to vote to extend these benefits. And the longer it goes on, if we withdraw it, we cause the Great Depression instantly. If we continue it, we make the Great Depression to come even worse, because what's going to happen is, as we go forward, we're not going to have the underlying economy to provide the tax revenue to pay for all this shit. In other words, when you put everybody on a universal basic income, which is where we're headed as a result of this unemployment benefit, in the end, it's going to end up being, government programs never get scaled down. They only get scaled up. Just think to yourself, can you think of any government program? Okay, I can think of one. Reagan shutting down the savings and loans back in the early 80s and liquidating all the savings and loan real estate. That was the only time I can think of a government bureaucracy that literally did its job well enough to be out of existence. But on the other hand, 99.9% of the time, government programs only get bigger. This one almost has to get bigger, because they have now made 40 million people essentially government income addicts, like drug addicts. They have to have this money. If they don't, they can't pay their rent, they can't pay their car, they can't pay their mortgage, etc., etc. And then the statistics will look terrible, and then it'll cause a panic. And when that happens, people will look at the money, and suddenly they'll realize it's a lot of fiat currency, and then starts the hyperinflation, and then starts the depression, and well, this could be the end. I mean, I'm not saying it is the end, it could be the end, and that's the scenario that would push us into it. I mean, I hesitate to be that doom and gloomy, but I just don't see the way out, because the alternative, which is canceling the benefit, does exactly the same thing. We should have never started it. What would have happened? What would have happened if at the time COVID broke out, we did what I recommended, which is stop and wait? And clearly, here's what the data shows. And by the way, this is just an intellectual exercise because we didn't do it. But what we should have done is essentially nothing. Nothing. I'm not talking about nothing. We should have obviously tested, isolated the at-risk populations, but we should have never shut down the economy. We should have gone frankly, the Swedish route. Now, I know that they have a higher mortality rate than their neighbors in other countries. I know that by only sheltering the old people and leaving the young people out, a lot of young people, much more young people, have been affected than otherwise. But you know, there are no perfect solutions. The enemy of good is perfect. The best solution would have been to completely isolate the elderly and the sick of all ages, and everybody else, the face mask, the hand washing, all those other things, social distancing, all acceptable, all rational. Depends on the state. Every governor's a little different. I mean, in New York City, obviously, you have a much different density issue than you do in Butte, Montana. So obviously, the social distancing would have been different. But to put the whole country onto a course of dependency, which is where we are now, was a horrible, horrible mistake. And what that means is, I really just cannot see how to extricate ourselves from the mess we put ourselves in without a horrible disaster. Had we not done it to begin with, we would have looked really bad. The numbers would have been much worse than they have been, but we would already be on the other side of it. In other words, we would know where we were. We would understand the unemployment impacts of lost jobs. States could have dealt with it on a case-by-case basis. A lot of businesses would have never shut down to begin with. A lot of restaurants, a lot of bars, a lot of movie theaters would have never shut down. Old people wouldn't have been going to them, but that's just a portion of the market. Again, there's no perfect trade-off. It wouldn't have been a case where everybody would have avoided, or there would have been, we don't even know if you can get, at this point, herd immunity, as the saying goes yet. It's unclear from the statistics, and I'm not here to debate those statistics with you. From a financial point of view, we really fucked up because we have made 40 million new welfare dependents, is basically what we've done. And they're behaving rationally, which is to say they're not going to work. They're pretending to look for jobs while they collect these $23.50 an hour benefits that we're paying. And you tell me, go ahead, comment below right here. You tell me how to extricate ourselves from this fucking mess. Because the only way now is if we pull the plug, it's going to be a fucking disaster. Now you might say we could wean ourselves off. Tell me how that works. How do you wean back to work? And the longer people are out of a job, they tend to lose their job skills. In other words, I'm not saying that you forget how to do the basic job that you're doing, but you lose all of those work-related skills that we don't even think about. Simply getting up in the morning, taking a shower, being on time, dressing properly, driving to work, doing our job, just the mundane mechanics of being employed are being lost because laziness, the reason sloth is one of the 7 deadly sins, is laziness is contagious. The lazier you get, the lazier you become. It just is the way it is. And this is where we put ourselves. And now we're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. We're damned if we continue the benefits, because if we continue the benefits, we're printing up money out of thin air, and that's going to catch up with us, and it's going to cause a hyperinflation, and it's going to cause the economy to collapse just later than it would have otherwise. All we're doing now is pushing that ball down the road, but we're not curing the underlying problem. Or if we cut it off, we throw millions of people onto the street, we cause massive real estate foreclosures, we cause bank failures. Banks have those loans. Those loans are, this is going to be a little hard to understand how a loan can be an asset, but believe me, it is. In other words, if you owe money to Bank of America, and Bank of America, let's say you borrowed $10,000, Bank of America is carrying your loan of $10,000 on their balance sheet as an asset because they assume you're going to pay it back plus interest. If you don't pay it back, that makes that asset poisonous. Therefore, it has to be ultimately written off. When that happens, it reduces the bank's equity and leads to insolvency. Now imagine millions and millions of people with car loans and home loans and apartment developers. Imagine you're living in an apartment now, which I am, and you're living in an apartment development. I'm concerned because I know that if they withdraw this benefit, then the landlord is not going to have the money. Even if they can somehow stave off foreclosure, they're not going to have the money to properly maintain the property. I mean, if you got to spray for bugs, you got to fix the roof, you got to pick up the garbage, you got to have the grass cut, you got to keep the pool clean, all those other good things. All that stuff costs money. You have to have staff in the office. Well, what happens when the money isn't coming in? These are private businesses. They can't print money. It's got to come from somewhere. Right now, it's coming from enhanced unemployment benefits. But baby, when those puppies are over and these people have lost their job skills, and these 40 million people, now we're a country of 340 million people, but half of those, about 170 million, are either too old or too young to be actively working. That leaves a workforce of 170 million really. Cut the crap, don't get in the government figures. We're talking 40 million of that 170 million, okay, are out of work and collecting over 40 million are collecting unemployment benefits. Imagine and not just on them as individuals, but their families. How are they going to buy groceries? What's going to happen? Are they going to have to pivot to food stamps? We're talking giant shitstorm of disaster here. So the government, and Trump has been very, very clear on this, and Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer, and Mitch McConnell, they're all talking about extending the benefits. McConnell least of all, but they're all talking about extending the benefits. And when they do, whatever the formula is, they're almost going to have no choice. Mark my words, it's not going to be an instant reduction. It's going to run through at least January 31st of next year. And all we're doing is building the disaster. It's coming. So now that I've, completely depressed the shit out of you, and you're sitting here thinking to yourself, if you're rational, what's the way out of this? Hold on, I'm going to take a little sip of water because I'm getting dry talking to you. Okay, here we are. What's the way out of this? There is no way out of this. We're going to have to start over. That's what anti-politism is all about. In the meantime, let me repeat a piece of advice I gave you. Buy cryptocurrencies. Buy Bitcoin, buy Zcash, buy Ethereum. There's so many of them. Why buy them? Because unlike government currency, cryptocurrency can't be printed up out of thin air. In other words, there are only 21 million Bitcoins possible that can be mined based on the algorithm that was originally set up to mine Bitcoin. I've talked about that in prior podcasts. I'm not going to rehash how these algorithms work. I'm not going to talk about how Bitcoin mining works. Just all you have to understand in this discussion is only 21 million Bitcoins. After that, there are no more Bitcoins. Therefore, they have scarcity. Since they have scarcity, they have inherent value. Unlike dollars, which are being printed ad infinitum, and not just dollars, euros, rubles, yuan, which is the Chinese renminbi, call it whatever you want, pesos, pesetas, shekels, rupees, you name the currency. Every country in the world now is printing money like crazy, all backed up by US dollars, creating no scarcity of capital. Where you have no scarcity, you lose value. Okay, the money has lost. Since we went off the gold standard in 1971 under Richard Nixon, our money has lost 98% of its value from those days. In those days, and I was alive and well then, you could still find 10 and 20 cent a gallon gas. That's no bullshit until Jimmy Carter made a fucking mess of the energy market and created the Department of Energy, which was a stupid fucking idea, but I digress. I used to think he was the worst president, but he wasn't. Not by a long shot. The worst president, well, is James Buchanan, then after that is Barack Obama. But that's another discussion for another day. And I know I just pissed off everybody in the left by saying it, and it is what it is. I'm not going to join the white cult of guilt, and say that everything I say, if it involves someone who's black, as far as I'm concerned, Barack Obama happens to be black. I don't give a shit if he had pink polka dots. He sucked as a president. I mean, he was an historic figure. Okay, I digressed way much further than I went. So, anywho, back to the subject. How do we get out of it? We don't. We're not going to get out of this, guys. We're not. I'm sorry. I'm going to flat out say it. We're not getting out of this in one piece. This is the beginning of a disaster, not the end. This is not the end of a cycle. This is not us coming to the end of the curve. This isn't going to all end in a rosy picture. Years and years ago, during the fall of the Soviet Union, in 1988 to 1990, in that area, a lot of Jews were escaping from the Soviet Union. And because I speak Russian, and I'm not changing the subject, stick with me, I volunteered at Jewish Family Services, where I lived in Tucson, Arizona, to meet a lot of these. A lot of them came to Tucson. They were spreading out all over the country as a result of Jewish Family Services doing that. People escaping the Soviet Union and the anti-Semitism of Eastern Europe. And I was really the only Russian speaker in the whole Tucson Jewish Federation. So I would go to the airport and meet these families and bring them and get them resettled, get them in their apartments, yada, yada, yada. It was just some community volunteer work. So anyhow, and it was very successful, and I made a lot of friends among the Russian Jewish community moving to the United States. And a lot of these people were secular, non-secular Jews, or secular Jews, or it's not. I always get that confused. Which one means non-religious? Most Jews are not very religious. Most Jews, believe it or not, are not very religious. They're very Jewish, but not very religious. And some are, but the vast majority are not. The vast majority of Jews are Reform Jews, which is to say, we're the Unitarians, and I'm a Reform Jew of Judaism, which is to say, there might be a God, but then again, there might not. But we're very Jewish. Anyway, the reason I bring this up is we talked about what it is to be a Russian, and one of them said something to me I'll never forget. And they said, one of the things that's amazing about you Americans is that you're genuinely surprised when things don't go as planned. Whereas a Russian, we expect it. So that's a very important distinction. Understand that right now, millions of people are assuming somehow, in the back, or at least hoping in the back of their minds, that this is all going to somehow work out. It's not. It's not. This is it. This is the shitstorm coming. We're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. If we continue and we print money, we end up in a hyperinflation and a disaster later. If we stop now, we end up in a depression right this very second. You tell me how we get out of this. You tell me how we tell 40 million people politically. You tell me how political leaders, being pressured by their various groups on the right and the left, whether it's old people to the Republicans or it's welfare recipients to the Democrats, you tell me how we pull the plug on all of this and get out of this gracefully without a fucking disaster. And President Trump, as I spoke to in my last podcast, I prayed we didn't have a crisis while he was president because I knew he wasn't going to handle it well, being the glib narcissist and man-child that he is, and he's not handling it well. He's trying to turn the clock back, and already they're stopping going to his rallies. The reason his rally the other day that he held was so poorly attended is even his own supporters are getting tired of his story. It was fine when things were great, but now it's like, ooh. But there's no alternative. Joe Biden is, no better. But anyway, I'm not going there. Let's stick on the subject matter of today. Get cryptocurrency and buy gold. Buy gold. Buy as much gold as you possibly can. You can buy it in a gold mutual fund. You can buy the shares of what's called an ETF called GLD, which is like buying a share of stock that owns gold. You can buy the bullion yourself at a coin dealer and lock it and say, however you do it, gold and cryptocurrency, protect yourself. The shitstorm is coming. If you still have savings, convert those savings. Do not lay there waiting for it to happen. The stock market is a bubble. The economy is a bubble. It's all being artificially supported by printed fiat currency, and we've got to protect ourselves. And the way we're going to protect ourselves in the end is to become anti-politics, an anti-political government. A government that had been selected, not elected. A government made up of people with skin in the game who had the life experience and education to know what's going on, but were not members of political parties, would have never gone down this fucking road to begin with. This entire crisis would have been handled 180 degrees the opposite the way it has been. And if you don't believe that, pick up a copy of A Radical Reset. It's free if you download it if you're an Amazon Prime member in the Kindle Lending Library, or you can buy a paperback copy for very inexpensive. Buy the book, read the manifesto, understand how the system works, and become involved. Because this is it, guys. This is it. I can't warn you strenuously enough. We are damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. We are in the last lull before the storm. Okay, I am almost a Pollyanna by nature. I am a happy, happy guy. I live my life happy, 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 but this isn't going to end up happy, happy, happy. And a person who insists on being happy in the middle of a shitstorm is a fucking idiot. And I'd like to think I am not a fucking idiot. And I'm positive you're not a fucking idiot. So do me a favor. Click on the subscribe button. Get involved with anti-politism. Click on the notification button. I'm going to keep you in the loop on how to protect yourself as we go through this stuff. We have lots more to cover. I don't want to go any further today. This is as much as I'm going in this podcast. I just want you to understand this is it, and these are the reasons why. And we're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. And there is no good way out of this now. There's no plan B. These venal, self-serving, mostly lawyers, which is to say paid intellectual prostitute politicians that we have put in office, both Democrat and Republican, are so interested in their own political future over all else, they've lost sight of what they've done. They have fucked us with the law of unintended consequence. They have fucked us by making 40 million people dependents. They have fucked us by taking away the work incentive of tens of millions of America. They fucked us, and they've put no safety net underneath it. The only way out of this entire mess, as far as they're concerned, is to inflate the currency. And the way they're going to sell that to you is they're going to say we can't cut it off or we'll cause a deflation. And the last thing I'm going to share with you, historically speaking anyway, is at the end of the 19th century, from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, the greatest period of growth in American history, before there was any social safety net, before there was any welfare, it was our greatest period of growth. Statistically, more people lived out of poverty, the emergence of the American middle class, the emergence of America as the greatest economic power in the world, the emergence of the great engine of prosperity that America has been up to this point. All of that was done during a period of deflation. Things should become cheaper, not more expensive. Because think about it, if you're making a widget and you first make the widget And as time goes on, you develop new and better machines and new and better ways to make that widget. You're becoming more and more productive. That's what productivity is. And as you become more productive, the cost of what you're making should go down. The only reason everything goes up over time is because they continually cheapen the money by printing it out of thin air, particularly since 1971. We have fucked ourselves. We have fucked our country. We have fucked our future. We have fucked our culture. We are fucked. And it's a lot of fucking. I wish I could be happier. Listen, we're going to get out of this thing. It's just going to be a fucking mess. There is no way to tell you this is going to be clean and it's going to be easy. And the only road, not socialism. I mean, I can point to 100 million dead socialists around the world in the last century and tell you socialism doesn't work. And the only argument that modern socialists make is, well, we would be better at it. What an arrogant statement, as if they are somehow better people than Stalin and Khrushchev and Hitler. Let me tell you, when you're in the position of, you think you would be a better, socialist leader, but the fact is you have to be brutal, because everyone's waiting to stab the dictator in the back, which breeds paranoia, which breeds deaths. And I got 100 million dead socialists in the 20th century and a long record of failure to prove that's the argument that we're somehow better or more compassionate people are going to be better socialists is such arrogant bullshit. I can't believe people even buy into it for 30 seconds, which is why I set the age in anti-politism to hold office at 35, because I love young people and all that stuff, and I don't want to get into millennials and Gen X's and Gen Z's and all that kind of bullshit, but you know what? They just haven't been around long enough to understand. There's nothing new under the sun. You can't change human nature. You can't change a fucked up system. Communism/socialism are the same fucking thing. It always leads to a totalitarian state, and it always fails. So we need a newism, and that newism is anti-politism. This is the solution. I know nobody knows about it except our little group right now. So spread the word. Reach out to me. Go to antipolitism.org. Become involved. Let's change our future for the better. Let's get rid of the politicians, get rid of the parties, get rid of the money, get rid of the corruption, make rational decisions, and save our country and get back on track and restore the values that made America great while keeping all the good things that the modern liberal state has produced, like racial equality, like equal opportunity for women. All those things are great. It isn't a choice between either or. We can turn the clock back in the sense that we can restore values and the underpinnings of a sound society, and we don't have to throw out all the other gains. One doesn't lead to the other. We're not going back to the 1950s. We're not going back to Jim Crow. We're going to create a new society of new opportunity that's colorblind, gender blind, and it's going to provide more for everybody. And the system that's going to do that is called anti-politism. Pick up a copy of the manifesto, subscribe, click on the notifications, and that's it for today. I'm E.H. Ivins, and I'm signing off.